everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Aristotle's virtue ethics. I have this presentation divided into 3 sections to try to make them a little easier to digest than some of the longer videos I've been doing. So today we're just going to talk about the basics of the theory in this first video, and then the subsequent 2 videos will lay out the specifics of how Aristotle approaches virtue, and then some responses and critiques of the theory. So for Aristotle, it's important to place Aristotle in context. He is one of the 3 main Greek philosophers, 2 of which we've talked about already. So you remember Socrates from the Crito. We said is considered to be sort of the father of Western philosophy. He lived from around 469 to 399 BCE. And then the Crito, of course, was written by his student Plato, who had a more formal system of philosophy than Socrates, who was mostly a guy who liked to walk around and talk about ideas. Plato founded that school called the Academy in Athens, and that was where Aristotle studied. So Aristotle was Plato's student, and he studied under Plato before going on to act as a tutor and to form his own school later. So Aristotle learned from Plato, but he also branched out from Plato and really formed his own school of not just philosophical thought, but scientific reasoning and other modes of reasoning as well. So when we're talking about Aristotle, Aristotle really accomplished quite a bit in his lifetime. He studied under Plato in Athens, as I mentioned. From there, he moved on to be the personal tutor to Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is the conqueror from the area in Greece called Macedonia, who conquered the known world by the time he was 30 years old. So here we have a picture of Aristotle trying to tutor a very bored-looking Alexander the Great. Ultimately, Aristotle founded his own school called the Lyceum in Athens. And although Aristotle is known as a philosopher, he also taught politics and science and other disciplines there as well. So Aristotle is really a sort of a jack of all trades as an intellectual, and he focuses on a lot of different subjects that we would sort of compartmentalize into other areas of schools of thought now. So when we're thinking about Aristotle and we're thinking about virtue ethics, we can think a little bit about this diagram that we've been talking about on different ways to make moral decisions. We have our moral agent, we have the act itself, and then of course we have the consequences. So we saw with utilitarianism that the focus was going to be on consequences. We saw with Kantian ethics that the focus was on the moral agent. With Aristotle also, we're going to be focusing on the moral agent. However, our reasons for that and what it is about the moral agent are going to be very different. So you remember with Kant that Kant was very concerned about that moral agent's motives, his reasons for doing things. Aristotle's got a different approach. Aristotle is not concerned with motive. He is concerned with what kind of person you are, what personal qualities and character traits you possess. And his idea was that if you are a virtuous person, if you possess good qualities and character traits, this will just by default lead you to perform good acts, hopefully with good consequences. So Aristotle wasn't very concerned about producing good consequences, but he was very concerned with producing and cultivating virtuous human beings. So Aristotle's approach to knowledge is called natural law theory. And this is a theory that encompasses his idea about science and the natural world at the time. So this is something that we're going to need to kind of understand in order to know what Aristotle's ethics has to do with this idea that he repeatedly talks about in the reading, which is the function of man. So Aristotle is operating under the assumption that the natural world, the world around us, is both predictable and orderly. In other words, it's not this crazy random conglomeration of things and we never know what's going to happen next. Generally, for the most part, when we're talking about nature, we know what's happening, we know when it's going to happen, and we know why it's going to happen. This order is knowable to human beings, and we are able to understand the natural order because of our ability to reason. If we apply our ability to reason to the world around us, we will be able to detect this sort of natural law and order, and then we'll be able to live more productively in the world around us. And moreover, this order is the basis for morality. It's not just something that is nice to know about the natural world in which we live, but it's actually going to dictate how we ought to behave. So just like we talked about before with moving from an is to an ought, Aristotle is going to say the first step is to discern the specific order of the world around you and your own place in it, and that will tell you from there how you ought to behave. So the idea here is that the right thing to do would be whatever helps further and promote each individual items or organism's part in the natural order, and the wrong thing to do is going to be whatever goes against the natural order. So if we think a little bit more about this idea of a natural order, a good image to think about is these diagrams of ecosystems that you probably remember from elementary school or middle school. This idea of an ecosystem kind of portrays every single part of it as performing a vital function, and it's all kind of tied together in this nice holistic unit. So it's governed by the laws of cause and effect, and that's part of the natural order that Aristotle really zeroed in on. He really liked this idea of cause and effect as one of the main ways that we can understand and make sense of the natural order, and one of the main things that made it so predictable. In addition to that, everything has a unique purpose and function, he says, in the natural order. So just like in this diagram here, we have decomposers, we have plants that are producers of food and oxygen, we have predator animals, we have prey animals. Everything's coming together to form this nice, holistic, cohesive unit. So nothing in this natural order for Aristotle has no purpose. There might be things that don't have a purpose that are readily discernible by us, but if we apply our ability to reason, we will be able to understand that. So we can look around at the world around us and think about the things that we see, and we can probably pretty easily determine what the function or specific purpose in the ecosystem is of almost anything that we encounter. For example, a tree, like the one you see pictured here, or like the ones behind me. I'm out on my back porch today. These trees perform specific functions, right? So it might be to produce oxygen for the air. It might be to provide a habitat for animals or insects. It might be to provide shade. These function. Similarly, we can do the same thing with insects like honeybees. Bees have certain functions including pollinating plants and producing honey that have a lot to do with the well-being of the ecosystem. Predator animals like lions also have a function. We can talk about that not just with lions, but with any predator animal. One of their main functions is to keep the population of the prey animals down. Prey animals, of course, also have their own specific and unique function. So hopefully you're getting the idea here that we can look at any particular element of the natural world around us, whether it's plant, animal, or insect, or something else, and figure out what the specific purpose and function of that element is in the natural world. So what Aristotle really wants us to focus on here is what the specific function of human beings is in the world around us. And he says this has to be something that's unique and specific to humanity, because remember, each part of the ecosystem performs its own unique and specific function. So he's going to consider a few options, but we know it has to be unique to humans. First option that he considers is a life of what he calls nutrition and growth. That's just taking in nutrients and metabolizing them and using that to grow and develop as a living organism. He's going to reject that because it's not unique to human beings. Even plants can do that. Secondly, the life of sensation. That's just taking in information through the five senses and responding to that. Because other animals besides human beings can do that, he's going to reject that also. And he's ultimately going to arrive on one thing that human beings can do that he thinks no other organisms, no other animals, plants, anything can do. And I bet you've guessed it already. It's reason. So hopefully by now you've determined that reason is a very, very important aspect of almost every philosophical theory that we've looked at, and is of paramount importance to Aristotle also. So when we're talking about humans' unique function in the world, he says the function of man, humanity today we would say, is activity of the soul in accordance with a rational principle. In other words, humans' unique function is to live according to reason. Now there are some specific things Aristotle thinks we ought to do with our ability to reason. Like I already said, we're supposed to try to use it to determine the order of the world around us, and to not to get in the way of things that are trying to perform their natural function in the world. So what we're going to do next is discover how we are to use reason to achieve the good, and how we're going to use that to determine ethical and unethical behavior and ways of being.